Good morning, or afternoon, or evening, whatever it is for you. My name is James, and welcome to episode 1 of the Writing with James podcast. Coming to you almost live from my living room to talk about life, the universe, and things you didn't want to hear in the first place. Now, for those of you that have been with a View from the Middle for a while, which I'm assuming is most of you, at least for this first one, bear with me for a couple of minutes while I fill in anybody that might be coming across this for the first time. I do run a channel called A View from the Middle on YouTube, and I've done various different kinds of content on the channel, but the longest running, there's my chair creaking, the longest running segment, if you will, is a blog called Writing with James. And sometimes I would use it to pass along channel news or talk about YouTube related stuff, but mostly it was just me talking about whatever caught my attention of late or telling stories. And I typically tried to keep it between 10 to 15 minutes and use video of driving down the road. And that's where this podcast stems from. And I think it's also what made a few people tell me over time that you should try doing a podcast. And so I'm going to single out Nez Lever here because she was the one that really I don't want to say she pushed me to do it. She encouraged, I think is a better word. And I thought about it. And one thing about the YouTube channel is I've always kept it open to do different things. And I really don't want to pin it down to one subject because I would get bored with it. And I also didn't want to start a dozen different channels to cover all the things I wanted to do. And I was thinking a podcast would be something you would have to base on a particular subject. I wouldn't have that freedom to do a video on pro wrestling one week and do a reading of an Edgar Allan Poe story the next. But then I realized that Writing with James was essentially a mini podcast. It was opinions and stories, but I would avoid certain topics and often would not go too in depth on something so as to keep it at that 10 to 15 minute time frame, though sometimes it'd run longer or shorter. So I decided, well, why not? I can expand from the 10 to 15 minutes, maybe try to keep it around 30 minutes, give or take 5 minutes, and at least at first, I can elaborate a little more and talk about some topics I never talked about on Writing with James. And not that I care to get too controversial with anything, but there have been some cans of worms I decided not to open, and maybe we can break the seal on a couple of those. But the whole idea behind the vlog was to have the video of me driving down the road, so if you needed the visual, it was there. And it was like, you were riding in the car with me. But you could just listen if you wanted to do that. Sherry said she would sometimes listen while she was driving, so it was like I was riding with Sherry. Point being, we can do the same thing here. So I've decided to jump in, and we'll just see where it goes from here. All right, so keeping in mind that there have been subjects I haven't delved into in the past. I thought I would get into something that is hardly a hot topic at this point for the first one. It's something that probably should have been talked about 5 years ago, but it's still pertinent to some degree. I'm going to lead up to something, so just keep in mind I do have a point. Speaking from an American perspective, I am wondering if we haven't become too sentimental about things. And when I say that, I'm not talking about personal items. If your grandparents or your parents or your friend passes on, and you have something from them that you would hold dear, or you continue with some kind of tradition in honor of family or friends that are no longer with us. That's one thing. I have a cousin that was really more like a brother to me that passed years ago, and he would wear these Hawaiian shirts. And I have one of those shirts that I keep in a closet. So things like that of a personal nature are not what I'm talking about. I mean I'm talking about things that aren't even yours. And maybe sentimental isn't even the right word. I'm talking about latching onto something and refusing to give it up, mostly just because you were used to it. It's always been there. It's always been that way. Pro sports in the United States provides a good example of this. In the U.S., we have the big four sports leagues with the NFL and Major League Baseball and the NBA and the NHL. And I should also point out there are Canadian teams in all of those leagues aside from the NFL. And over the last couple of years, we've had a couple of teams change their mascot name. The Cleveland Indians in Major League Baseball became the Cleveland Guardians, and the Washington Redskins in the NFL eventually became the Washington Commanders. And people got upset about it. And I can understand to some degree why longtime fans of teams wouldn't like it. And I know I won't argue either side when it comes to discussing why the names were changed, which is because some people felt the names were insensitive toward Native Americans. I will say, as someone that is part Native American, I was never offended by it. But apparently some people were, and that whole subject is kind of a topic in itself. But people who had nothing to do with the teams were getting upset. And again, I can wrap my head around people that didn't like the reason for the change, but people were upset that teams didn't follow, and were not fans of changed at all, because that's the way it had always been for them. And I think part of the reason is, teams don't change names often anymore, unless they change locations. Like the Houston Oilers moved to Tennessee and changed their name to the Titans. But teams don't change their mascot often, just their mascot. If you go back to the early days of Major League sports in the U.S., the early part of the 20th century, teams changed names a lot. The New York Yankees, actually there's no probably to it. They are the most recognizable Major League Baseball team in the world. People that don't know squat about baseball have at least heard of the New York Yankees. But they weren't always called the Yankees. There is some debate if they ever officially held a name, but I believe when the franchise first came into existence, they were known as the New York Atlantics. And right before they were the Yankees, they were known as the Highlanders. The Dodgers, that's another well-known team. They had at least half a dozen names before they settled on Dodgers. And then even today, lower levels of play, minor leagues and junior league teams, they change their names all the time. The point being, teams have changed their names before, and the world didn't implode. It's just a sports team name. Now, I'll admit, if the Texas Rangers decided to change their name, I wouldn't like it much. But as the old saying goes, my rent will still be due on Friday. Ultimately, it won't affect my view of the world or change anything that is important in my everyday life. Which I didn't mean to get off on sports so much, but it was the best example I could think of to get across what I'm talking about. I also don't want to give any wrong impressions. I've never been a change for change's sake kind of person. I've always kind of followed the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But I've also believed that if you own something, you should be able to do with it as you please. I own my house. It happens to be painted white. If I want to paint it purple, I should be able to paint it purple. It doesn't matter why I'm painting it purple. If you rent a room from me, you might not want to live in a purple house, but if you find it that disturbing, you can always find another place to live. Or you can realize it's still a roof over your head, and it really doesn't matter what color it happens to be. The owners of the Cleveland Indians decided to change the team mascot to Guardians. It doesn't matter what the reason was. And if fans are that disturbed, they can root for another team, or they can realize it's still baseball in Cleveland, And what the team name is really doesn't matter. It's just a sports team mascot. I think for some people it is an extension of tradition. Even though it's not really the same thing as tradition, I think traditions are great. And I am in no way against doing things because of tradition. To celebrate Independence Day in the U.S., it's traditional to set off fireworks. Some people might start the tradition of going to a certain restaurant on an anniversary. People traditionally have turkey on Thanksgiving. Of course, the difference between that and someone else changing something that means something to you is that you don't have to participate in traditions if you don't want to. And it's still there for others. Okay, nobody is forcing someone to set off fireworks on July 4th. You don't have to have turkey on Thanksgiving. But it's there if you want to do it, and it's still there for others that want to take part in it. You do have some people that try to stop certain traditions and just end it for everybody, and that's not right either. To give you an example, and sorry, this kind of goes back to sports in a way. That's just the way it's turning out. We talked about the Indians changing their name. Well, the mascot from the high school I went to was also the Indians, and it still is. But our town was named after a Comanche chief. So there is that. For those that might be outside the U.S., we have basically 3 different levels of public education. Where I live, we have elementary, which is ages 5 to 10. And from ages 11 to 13, you go to middle school, or as it's often referred to, is junior high. And then there is high school, which is 14 to 17. At least when the school year starts. And when I went into middle school, they had built a brand new middle school. And my class was actually the first class to go to the new school for all 3 years. And in the front of the school, they had what was really just a generic drawing of an Indian head that we all called the chief the town was named after. It probably had no resemblance to the real chief, but that's what we called it. And it was embedded in the floor just inside the front door. And since the high school mascot was the Indians, the middle school mascot was the Braves, since we were younger. And we were part of starting the tradition and continuing the tradition of stepping on the chief on the days of a Braves football game to get the chief mad so we would win. Years later, about 20 years later, a lady, and I use that word loosely, went on a public tirade with letters to the editor of the newspaper and all this, going back and forth with people. She wanted to end this tradition, and she claimed it taught kids that it was okay to use violence against Native Americans or some such. Well, we are young in middle school, but we are not stupid. I'm assuming kids that age are still not stupid. It's just a silly little thing to show some school spirit, and you didn't have to do it if you didn't want to do it. And I don't think anybody before this woman ever thought, hey, that means I can go stomp on an actual person. But in this woman's tirade, she did bring up a story that does make a good point to some extent. Doesn't really help her argument, but I'm going to pass that story along just to kind of help tie together some of the things here. It was referred to as the ham story. And you can tell the story has some age to it. Can you hear the bell in the background? Sorry, but I am doing this from my living room. At least the dog's not barking in the neighbor's yard. But you can tell that the ham story has some age to it. But as the story goes, a young couple get married. And a few days into the marriage, the wife is going to bake a ham. And the husband is sitting in the kitchen, watching her get everything ready. And he notices that before she puts the ham in the pan, she cuts a big piece off the end of it. And he thinks, well, that's a big piece to cut off the ham. It seems kind of wasteful. So he asked his new wife, why do you cut such a big piece off the end of the ham? Well, the wife stops, looks at the ham, looks at the piece she cut off, and then says, well, actually, I don't know. I learned how to cook from my mother, and that's the way she did it, so that's the way I do it. Well, the husband shrugs, and they go about their day. About a month later, the wife's mother drops by for a visit, and as she's leaving, she mentions she's going to go home and cook a ham. And the husband says, that reminds me, she cooked a ham a few weeks ago, and she cut a big piece off the end of the ham before she put it in the pan. She said she did it that way because that's the way you did it. Why did you cut such a big piece off the end of the ham? And the wife's mother said, well, I don't know. I learned how to cook from my mother, and that's the way she did it, so that's the way I do it. Well, now the husband is just baffled. Now, how many generations does he have to go back to get the answer? Well, eventually it's Thanksgiving, and the whole family gets together, and as fate would have it, the husband ends up seated next to the wife's grandmother. And he's been wondering about this for months, so he just comes out and asks, when you cooked the ham, why did you cut such a big piece off the end of the ham? The grandmother looked at him like he was crazy and said, well, we didn't have a lot of money, and the only pan we could get was very small, so I had to cut that much off because it wouldn't fit in the pan. Now, of course, the moral to the story is that just because that's the way it's always been done doesn't mean that's the way it has to be done. And there is merit to that line of thinking. It doesn't mean you should go out of your way to stop people from doing something just because you don't want to do it. Eventually common sense has to take over. Stepping on the image on the floor of the middle school isn't an act of violence. It's just a silly thing kids do before a football game. On the other end of that spectrum is the bonfire they had at Texas A&M University. They would traditionally hold it around Thanksgiving. That's my phone, had to make an appearance. But there was no formal way of building the bonfire, and no real safety measures. And in 1999, the bonfire collapsed. Not while it was lit. It was still being built, but it collapsed. And 12 people were actually killed. Now, that did end the tradition, though they did bring it back a few years later, doing away with some smaller traditions surrounding it. They don't allow alcohol in the area now. That's probably a good thing. But they are emphasizing safety. It's more organized. But they did end a lot of traditions surrounding that because of what happened. And it was dangerous. And if someone had looked at that a year or two earlier and said, hey, this is not very well organized, maybe they would have saved some lives. So there is the other end of that spectrum, but stepping on a pitcher on the floor doesn't really fit in with that. But after all this, I guess I better get to what inspired what I wanted to talk about if I'm going to keep this around 30 minutes. I don't even remember the exact year, but a handful of years ago, there was a movement to ban what has commonly been referred to as the Confederate flag. Now, of course, what I'm talking about is actually the Confederate battle flag, but over the years it came to be known simply as the Confederate flag, the stars and bars, if you will. And the reason it was to be banned is because people felt it promoted racism and was racially insensitive. Some people went to the extreme of claiming it was a symbol for wanting to bring back slavery. You get the idea. Now, I am from Texas, and Texas has always been in a bit of a gray area when it comes to being a southern state. Technically, we are more southwest. In reality, we have always kind of been our own thing. There weren't a lot of people around here that were the South shall rise again kind of people. That's my phone again. I did know a few people that would display Confederate flags in some way, even if it was just a little sticker on the back glass of their vehicle or something like that. None of them displayed their flag as a symbol of racism. They just thought it was a neat-looking flag. And of course, one nickname the flag has been given was the rebel flag. And that's what a lot of them used it for, was the symbolism for being a rebel. And that's the way it was in general. It was not a racist thing. Jimmy Carter used it in campaign promotion when he ran for president, as did Bill Clinton. It, famously was on top of the car on the Dukes of Hazzard, a car that was named the General Lee. That was a network television show. Tom Petty would use a big one as a backdrop during concerts. Nobody screamed racism because it wasn't being used as a racist tool. That's what people got used to. Problem is, the Ku Klux Klan decided to adopt it and start using it during marches. Now things changed. And while I don't agree with the way some people were going about things, the ones wanting to ban Confederate flags did have a point. What people were used to was taken by someone else and used in a bad way. It was becoming their symbol, like it or not. And it's not the first time something like that happened. The swastika was once a symbol of prosperity and good fortune, and often used by Hindus and Buddhists. There was a Canadian women's hockey team that used it as their logo. They would play their hockey games with a big swastika on their sweaters. It was even on American military uniforms. We got to look at one in a video I did on a history museum in Ardmore, Oklahoma. The U.S. Army's 45th Infantry Division, which was based in Oklahoma, used the swastika as their logo. Then, the National Socialist Party adopted it in Germany in 1919. A little over a decade later, this guy named Adolf rose to power in Germany, and a couple of years after that, they started using the swastika as part of the national flag. Everybody else that used it, even though they had it first, and it certainly didn't represent to them what it did to Adolf and his party, they decided they didn't want to use it anymore. The 45th Infantry Division changed their logo to the Thunderbird, which is what they use to this day. Adolf ruined it for everybody. No, I'm not going to agree with the tactics used by some people. I don't think accusations of racism should be cast out on people who are not racist. And I do think people should be able to do what they want to do as long as they aren't hurting somebody else. There is a good point here. If someone takes something that is innocent enough and starts abusing it and using it for the wrong thing, you should learn to leave that thing behind. Maybe someday it can be reclaimed. I don't think there's any hope for the swastika ever being used again, but maybe other things will run their course. And to look to the future, maybe the Ku Klux Klan can start waving the flag of the IRS so we can do away with that. But that's another topic. It could all come out in the wash. Okay, I think I'm probably getting close to 30 minutes at least, so let me wrap this up. I don't even know how that went because I'm not used to talking that long. Hopefully I didn't jump around too much and let the point get lost in the rambling. This is a work in progress. But I will try to do one of these a month, and we'll just see how it goes from there. Maybe I can build up and have guests and such. I just wanted to do that for the first one because that's kind of one of those things I've thought about talking about, but then at the same time it's like, I don't know if I really want to put that out there or not. Because people are going to already know there are going to be some people that they don't listen to the whole thing. They catch a key word and then they're, but oh well. But we'll have to wait and see how it goes. If you are new to the content and would like to check out the YouTube channel A View from the Middle, well, I don't know how this. I don't even know how this is presented online. So I'm sure there is a place somewhere I can leave a link. But if you want some mini versions of a podcast, take a look at the Writing with James playlist. And of course, I've got a ton of other content on there to do all kinds of stuff. I hope you enjoyed listening. Thanks for coming along for the ride. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe. Not necessarily in that order, if that's even what I'm supposed to say at the end of a podcast. And I will see you next time.